We're recording this on Tuesday morning, UK time, and the World Cup is still on at the moment. And one of the teams participating is Brazil, which is an amazing story in itself. Hopefully we'll get time to talk about that, because joining us, Robert Burgin, the football manager of Brazil Rugby League. Robert, how are you? How are things in Australia? Because that's where you are at the moment.
Yeah, it's very nice and sunny, but also I'm indoors because we're in lockdown in Queensland today. So that'll extend until Sunday.
Let's ask the big question then. What's happening? What's happening with the World Cup from your perspective in Brazil, in Queensland? What is happening with the World Cup in 80 days' time or whatever's going on?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that with more clarity. I mean, I probably have a dozen conversations a day that end with the phrase, but that depends on the World Cup. And that could be whether we're selling our car, whether my wife's getting a dog at Christmas time. It could be whether the South American Championship happens next year or the World Cup gets postponed and every fixture that we have gets pushed out by 12 months. So, I've got players constantly messaging me, but all I can keep saying to people is it all depends on the outcome of the World Cup. And that's my entire life at the moment.
We'll talk about your life in a minute, which is an astonishing one in terms of actually setting up rugby league in places where it's never been heard of before. But my first question is really, do you think this is a seminal moment for international rugby league, that some battle lines have been drawn, and how we move forward from this, whether the World Cup goes ahead as planned, whether it gets delayed or possibly even cancelled? Do you think we're now at a point where we need to define what we actually want from international rugby league and how important it is to the sport?
I do. I've used the phrase watershed moment many times in conversations backwards and forwards with other people, and they've also used it in conversation as well. I believe that it's Australia and New Zealand's prerogative if they wish to stay at home, but the rest of the world needs to prove that it can sustain itself without those two nations. And that's not just in this particular World Cup instance. I think if we don't do it now, we're probably never going to have as great an opportunity or as great a test to do so. And until we diversify and have different events and pathways that don't involve Australia and New Zealand, then we're never going to know, and we're never going to have the confidence that we can do anything without them. And that holds the sport back in so many ways.
And you know better than anyone the role of the volunteer in all of this, the role of passion. But somewhere along the line, there has to be resource. And I think you will be the first to agree that people like Taz Battieri and Kevin Rudd, other people we could mention who we might term as pioneers, have, to coin one of Taz's phrase, which I know you've written about again recently, have done it on the smell of an oily rag. At some point, somebody has to allocate some resource to international rugby league. Where do you see that coming from?
Well, the great hope is that would in part come from the World Cup, the hosting of the World Cup, which in conversations I've been a part of, they all said it was set to deliver the highest amount ever. And for all the good that we've had out of Australia in terms of commercial output for the game, we've seen that World Cups from Australia have not delivered on the amounts that were promised from those. And I know developing nations have been told in the lead up to those 4-year cycles, just wait until after the World Cup and then the funds will be available to do, very minimal things. I'm not talking tens of thousands of dollars. I'm talking in the singular thousands of allocations. But that hasn't happened, and we've been waiting and waiting. And I guess there's two sides to it. We all know that IRL is under-resourced and understaffed, but that's not necessarily the fault of the people that are there at the moment. They've been handed, $40 to build a house is how I often refer to it. And it's very, very difficult to do anything other than just stay alive and keep breathing in the current situation.
How do you change that? Because clearly, I think we all agree that this is what a World Cup's about, and it's not who wins it. It's the ability to put the sport in a showcase, as you pointed out on so many occasions, take it to new markets, which are far bigger than the existing ones that we're in at the moment, to gather more corporate interest in what we do, more perhaps media rights and broadcasts. But basically, how do we impress upon those who currently provide the bulk of the players certainly at the elite level, that they have a responsibility outside of their own competition?
Yeah, two sides to that. I think partly you would hope that you don't have to impress upon people. I think that doing the decent and honest thing and a compassionate thing would be second nature, as it is for most of us that are developing rugby league. And I used the example in a tweet and a Facebook post the other day that's gone far and wide, that in talking with the NRL and requesting some coaching and development materials, the phrase was used directly to me, "We can't pass it on, that's our intellectual property," which is extremely disappointing, not only because of the way it was shut down, but that phrase that we think there's intellectual property withholding a country like Brazil, or even a smaller country like, let's say, El Salvador, that's developing at the moment, that we would hold them back because of our IP, and that is somehow hugely valuable to a Spanish-speaking country on the other side of the world, and not just a way to save a volunteer 40 hours away from their family developing a opposition course from scratch. To me, that my mind boggles at saying stuff like that. I do understand it, and I understand it's been the job of the IRL to deliver coaching and development materials, which it also hasn't done. So we can't say all the blame lies on the NRL, but as we'll probably venture onto later, I think, and I have to choose my words slightly here for a PG program, I guess, but a lot of things in international rugby league come down to a swinging appendage competition, and coaching and development materials have become one of those. We've probably spent 5 years waiting for who's going to deliver it, and 50% of people want it to be an RFL model, 50% want it to be an NRL model. No one supplies it, no one agrees to where it's going, and the only people that suffer in the meantime are the countries outside of the top 3 or 4, and everyone that is making the decision are the ones that their livelihood or their progress doesn't depend on it. And the bit that angers me about that is it's a huge waste of time. Like, you're wasting people's actual lives. Like, they're waiting 5+ years to do that. And then the second side to it is you ruin relationships. It's not about we want more money, etc. Most of us get involved in rugby league, and especially at a developing level, to build relationships with people, like help build relationships between Australia and a third world country, help find new friends and introduce new people to the sport and give them a better pathway into life through rugby league. And slowly we're eroding everybody's relationships, like my face-to-face relationships with players and coaches that I've worked with across, South and Central America and even other countries that we've helped out on occasions. At the end of the day, you become the person that they don't trust because we're not delivering any of the things that we tell them. And in many cases, and not solely myself, but other people that do this, if you're the only one that goes into a country because no one else is doing it, then you're the one to blame. And so, maybe out of the last 10 years of developing rugby league, I've, made 200 great friends, but slowly, those relationships are getting really, really tested because people think, why have you led me down this path of wasting my life, in essence, which is, that's really hard to combat at the moment because we appear like a directionless sport. And I've been recommending people spend time away from their families and spend their money and spend their time to take up this sport. And it's not been to any great reward at this point in time for many, many people.
Rugby league is a sense of frustration for many, wherever you are in the world, it seems. And one of those frustrations at the moment is I can flick through the TV this week. I can see the Rugby Union Lions play in South Africa. I can see a number of Australian cricketers playing in the 100. The Olympics is obviously ongoing. No one's denying that COVID isn't a problem, of course. We all know that. Some of us personally and some of us not, but we can all see the effects it's had on society. Is the sense in Australia, is there any sense in Australia that the NRL are using COVID as an excuse when obviously there are other reasons for not coming to the World Cup?
Yeah, I think there is that sense in some sections, particularly for people who love international rugby league and understand the prerogatives that operate. I also think the attitude in Australia towards COVID is much more cautious, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I've got to say, I'm very much a cautious person when it comes to COVID, but then I went and spent 3 and a bit months in Brazil in the middle of a pandemic and operated around people who had COVID, had it previously. I arrived into my wife's hometown and had a barbecue with someone who tested positive to COVID the next day. And then they had 2 weeks out. They recovered fully. And I went to the gym with them for every day for a couple of weeks after that. And I never caught it in the time I was there, but I was cautious. I wore a mask. I constantly sanitized. I took a lot of precautions. I was tested frequently. So I'm not treating it with disdain as if it doesn't occur. But I also know, any of our athletes that caught it outside of the bubble events that we had, which, we didn't have anyone contract it when we had bubble camps in Brazil. But those that did catch it outside of that, they undertook the necessary recovery processes and they recovered. Like they had to put in some work, but, they got there. And, the opposite side to that is, mate, I know probably more than a dozen people personally that have died from COVID. So I'm not denying that it exists, but I think there is a balance here where you have to know it's real and be cautious with it, but also that there is a possibility of operating if you're a sensible group, a sensible human beings about it.
I mean, this almost seems a glib question, but with the plans the Rugby League World Cup organisers have put in place, which they shared last week, for the athletes, for the support staff going out to the World Cup, you, as someone very important in terms of a country going there, you wouldn't want to send your athletes or staff to a competition which would potentially jeopardise their health or lives.
We're in our position, we're constantly jeopardising people's lives by making them go out on a field and play a tough contact sport. So it's not like it's a divergence. We have to do this all the time. It's just a new level of risk that we're deciding upon. So, even the people who, if they play NRL and stay at home or they play an Australia-New Zealand game, they're still going to be at risk. It's just mitigating that risk and having responsibility over it. I'm comfortable. I know that the NRL's perspective that not enough information was supplied early. I think there were some very grey areas about how teams would operate in their camp in the World Cup without coming into contact, and how new team members would interact with the team. But someone else said this on Twitter the other day, and it's something that I operate by all the time, is that if you go looking for obstacles, you're going to find them. And to me, I always measure people by intent. Whatever someone intends to set out to do, you can usually tell from a long way off. And sometimes people intend to do a lot better than what they do and they fail. And other times people just intend to do one thing and they'll hammer away at it until they get there. And I think we can all see from the NRL club position over the last year where that's been headed. It's not new.
In terms of, obviously, we won't know possibly until tomorrow or slightly later in the week when the World Cup board come up with what we believe will be their final decision. They're pinning everything, I think, now on player choice, player voice. What's your gut feeling? Because obviously, not only are you involved in Brazil, but you talk to people across the clubs in the NRL who have allegiances that might be important within this World Cup. Do you think that enough players are either prepared to or economically can defy the wishes of their clubs and still come over and play in a World Cup?
Yeah, it's all about momentum and about group dynamics. And we spoke just briefly off air before we came on. I think that, say, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, I was very confident that this World Cup would go ahead. Over the last couple of days, I've started to be less so. But I honestly think that if someone calls a World Cup on, that the group mentality and the competitiveness of rugby league will come to the fore. And all it takes is one or two players to say, I'm going to play for Italy, I'm going to play for Samoa, and then Tonga or whoever else, Fiji or Jamaica, etc., they'll think, oh, geez, they've got such and such playing. We're going to need XX player. And then they'll bring them. And then to combat that, another team's going to bring someone else. And at the end of the day, if you turn up to a sword fight, you want your 13 best swordsmen. So I don't think in the competitive world of rugby league that everyone would sit back on their hands and just put out a second-rate team at the end of the day. I think the reality is we're not going to see all of the best players, but we're going to see some great narratives. And that's one thing that rugby league, should be good at doing and is most time is telling the great narratives that exist in our sport. So best of the best, I don't necessarily think it has to be. And I wrote quite an extensive column about, when America pulled out of the 1980 Olympics and what happened in the void that was created when Yugoslavia went on to win the gold medal. And since that time, the number of foreign players in the NBA has gone from 2% up to around 25%. So was that a seminal moment, a watershed moment in the development of international basketball? And some of the teams that have risen to the fore in those, 40 years or so, they've got Nikola Jokic as the MVP of the NBA from Serbia. You've got, countries like Australia, countries like Spain that have developed a long way. And I think it's possible in rugby league. If we just open the door ajar, perhaps we're talking about Serbia in the same language in rugby league as well in, 30 to 40 years' time. Someone will be inspired. Someone will find out or watch because their dad or their uncle or someone else had a part in it, and they're going to want to finish their legacy. Rugby league has some really big cycles, I guess, that you can identify if you look close enough. And, one of those is, say, like 25 years is often the period between when someone plays and when their son plays. And they will often follow similar patterns. Or mass migration. So like when there's a country sends a lot of refugees to Australia, 25 years, suddenly a heritage team pops up. And then that heritage team transfers back to the homeland. And then that becomes an ongoing concern, as we've seen with countries like Lebanon. And these are patterns that if you look for them, you'll find them. And I think if Australia and New Zealand don't go to this World Cup, we can expect to see patterns evolve. It happens in economies, it happens in everything. So we play the numbers and we could create a new wave here.
We'll talk about your narrative in a moment because it is absolutely fascinating. And we need to hear the story. People need to realise the work that you've put in on your own back in developing rugby league, which goes so far above and beyond, what should be taken for granted as a volunteer role. But just finally on the World Cup, there's obviously talk over here that perhaps an Australian Indigenous and New Zealand Maori team could come and represent those two nations. There seems to be a feeling again among the players that would represent them that that's something they'd be incredibly keen and proud to do. Would you advocate that would be an acceptable solution to the men's tournament?
Yeah, I'm really torn on this. So first of all, anything that makes the tournament go ahead, I'm all for. Secondly, people are going to say this isn't a sovereign nation, that these games won't count as internationals, which is true. So whoever plays against the Maori or the Indigenous, it won't count for the opposition team as an international, which will be, I guess, quite hurtful to them in their legacy. But that's probably a selfish way of looking at it. And I also know from my interactions with friends and fellow players who are Indigenous or Maori that, their consideration is they are a nation and they were a nation before we came in and toyed with them. So it all comes down to just because it's a nation under the current definition, is it not a nation and, at another time? So that's a really tricky philosophical point to make. But I guess away from that, I think if we are going to rely again on the Indigenous and Maori simply because it gives us NRL players, that doesn't go back to solve the earlier point that we need to diversify away from relying on these competitions at some stage. And I, within my heart of hearts, I would like to see Serbia or USA as the two last teams that were excluded from qualifying, my preference would be for them. And I think that the potential to grow from there and make a lasting impression is also huge. I was hugely inspired by what they did in 2013. So I worked for Rugby League Week that year, and my primary focus during the World Cup was following the USA round. I actually slept in their team hotel, or like on the floor of the room of some of their players while I was in that tournament. I was on their team bus, and that really inspired me, that whole journey that way they went through. I was there when they flew in from 3 different continents the night before and beat France the next day in Toulouse, which is a huge, huge achievement. But also they then get put up against Australia, and then they go to another World Cup and they're in a death pool basically. But say USA comes to this one and they get to compete with a few more teams on level pegging with them, where could that eventuate?
Yeah, we go back to things like the Emerging Nations World Cup, and that doesn't exist anymore, but there you go. As long as they don't let New South Wales and Queensland into the World Cup instead of Australia or New Zealand, then we'll be in a better place.
Funny aside to that, today, during the past couple of days, I guess, of firing missives in the direction of the NRL, I had a friend who kind of works for them, but within Queensland, and they said, don't you dare throw Queensland in the same boat as New South Wales Rugby League, because they know that the allocation that they get and the consideration they get in Queensland is far below what exists in Sydney. And then people in Western New South Wales would say the same about Sydney, and people in Western Australia will say the same. So as much as we're, I guess, having a chop at the NRL across the board at the moment, it really is Sydney. And that's where a lot of thinking is confined to.
It's good to see that rugby league is parochial in Australia is in the north of England, but that's I think that's a discussion for another day. There's no, I don't know, more exciting brand in world sport than Brazil. I went to the Olympics in 2012 here in the UK and went to see the Brazilian football team play New Zealand at St James's Park. It was packed full of people because they wanted to see Brazil. Brazil, not a nation we associate with rugby league. My dog's excited. Brazil, not a nation we associate with rugby league. How's it happened? What's happened?
Yeah, I guess, there's lots of parts to the story before it come together, but I'll try and be as succinct as possible. So, 2013, we decided to make a concerted effort to start rugby league in all Latin American nations, from Mexico all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And we gradually chipped away at that. And I'll say Brazil was not one of the first nations that stood up. We're very surprised. It was more El Salvador and Chile to start with. And that was mainly because of refugee status in Australia, the number of people that had gone back and forwards in the 1980s between those countries. But then we found a bunch of people in Brazil that when Sports Plus was actually broadcast over there free to air in 2013, they watched Sonny Bill Williams and the Sydney Roosters win in a pretty exciting grand final against Manly Warringah. And at that time, not many people will realise this, that had one of the, I think it's the top 6 or top 5 ratings in the world was in Brazil for rugby league. And since then, the sport is not free to air anymore over there. It's not, basically, you can't get it on TV at all unless you pay NRL Live Pass for $20 a week, which is equivalent to about 30% of your income in Brazil, which is another point maybe we'll get to one day. But yeah, so there was people there. And then what happened was there was about 4 different pockets across the country. All these people that loved Sonny Bill Williams, that loved the Sydney Roosters, and they started competitions in their town, but they only ended up having enough people either to play against at school or they just had training sessions and never had games because the distance between each city was about 8 hours. And then a fellow called Hugo Flores came along and he combined everyone. Basically, he's responsible for consolidating everybody and getting them on the same page and competing and overcoming those distances. And so they've competed at the last 2 South American championships. They're current reigning champions in men's and women's for South America. Even though Chile is ranked slightly higher, Chile didn't go to the last South American championships. So I think, within Australia, the Brazilian team that operates in Australia is, 10 players are actually born in Brazil, 4 players have both parents who are Brazilian, and then we've got 2 that are, heritage players, which is, I think, compared to most other heritage teams, a very small amount of grandparentage or parentage relationship. So the potential is really there. Country of 220 million people, not afraid to play combat sports. How many Brazilians are in the top tiers of MMA? So I think there's a natural desire to be physically active and to play sports that test them and to combine all the elements that make rugby league. Movement of the ball, pace, timing, speed, things that Brazilians can bring to the sport. So that's really how it's developed.
Would you say it was a brave move by the World Cup organisers to invite the Brazilian women? Or do you think that as a nation, this is the kickstart? I mean, I've seen obviously some of the announcements you've made about who's going to be in the squad, some of the training camps you've had, that speed and dexterity is natural, as you say, to the athletes in Brazil, and that even in Sevens Rugby Union, they have this ability to surprise people. Was it a brave decision, and is it absolutely the right decision, and why it's so important this World Cup goes ahead for nations like Brazil, Jamaica, Lebanon, as opposed to worrying too much about whether Australia and New Zealand need or want to come? Sure,
yeah, it is 100% a brave decision. I didn't think we were going to get that decision, and it was, again, goes back to Hugo Froese and all the hard work he did in lobbying for that position, but he also put in a very professional submission. And then, I know there's other teams that are very disappointed they missed out in the women's tournament, such as Fiji, Italy, USA. But it all came down to the timing when Hugo made his submission, the strength that was behind it. Obviously, having 220 million people in your country, I think it's the 5th largest economy in the world. These things don't hurt at all. So I believe maybe we've been given the inside running, but we haven't in many other ways. We've never had a single proper technical or development visit from outside the world. So we haven't had those things go our way. It's all been volunteers that have gone over and done this work. So, yeah, I think the important thing for it to go ahead, and, next year we're going to see the Rugby League Union World Cup's going to more solidify. And I know they'll have great interest in signing our players. As whenever we've announced someone is part of our squad and within the camp, they suddenly get a call the next week to say, would you like to come for testings for our Sevens squad? So, that's a big issue, obviously. Many people have already allocated all their holidays and their budget. Dependent on this, they've made life decisions dependent on the World Cup going ahead. I think if we were to wait another 12 months, I don't know even if the World Cup can wait another 12 months realistically. But if it was to do so, I think we're working off a much lower base in terms of what's possible. We're stringing very modest sponsorships over a 2-year period rather than a 1-year period. We're making every developing nation rely on a 5-year World Cup cycle rather than a 4-year World Cup cycle. So we're starting to pinch at every corner of what's possible. Fascinated by the story of development as you are, and the very different models you can use to start a sport in a country where initially it might be foreign to them. And you've done it both ways. You've done it with, if you like, exiles, heritage players in Australia. You've also done it in the nations themselves. There isn't one size fits all, is there? So all these people that say, money just needs allocating, it's not quite as simple as that, is it? No, I think we often demonise one method or the other, the top-down or the bottom-up development. Some people think one's useless, people think the other's useless, but I think it's all situational. And another thing I get really annoyed at is people commenting on how, countries have failed in development in some areas when they haven't followed a model, and particularly a model that follows Australia, because what people are measuring against is a league and an environment that has existed for more than 100 years. So they've got to remember that a lot of these countries are at year 4 and 5 of their development. If you go back to when Australia was in year 4 and 5 of its development, they had 4 clubs. They had some very, very loose rules about rugby union players or English players playing for Australia. Some of the people we celebrate, like Dally Messenger, his involvement in rugby league in the early years is pretty dicey when you look back at it. He was a mercenary. So it's great he took part, but let's not lose sight of history and what it took to develop the sport in these countries. For me to say what works in Brazil will work in Malta, will also work in Japan, will work in Thailand is complete fallacy. That each environment has its own solutions.
In terms of sort of where we go from here, because we haven't got much time left, and it's just great having you and having your input on all of this. You mentioned at the beginning something which I think is even more concerning than the World Cup maybe not going ahead as planned is relationships, because I think sport is all about, how you interact with people. And if rugby league has a strength, it's the fact that we all tend to circle the wagons a little bit when the going gets tough. I would hate to think that somebody like you, who has done so much, would become disillusioned with the way the sport is being run. How wary should we be of that and take that into account? Countless people, as I think I do as well, who are good people who've dropped out of the sport. How worried are you that this might be another of those moments that it's sink or swim?
I'm extremely worried about it. I probably don't want to add to it too much by expressing the sense of despair that I'm hearing and seeing at the moment, but you've got to be honest that it's out there. I think the relationship that I'd probably like to talk about is that relationship between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. I think there's a big divide there that in some instances on both sides is childish. I think we're holding on to grievances from the past. We're not seeing things through each other's eyes. And Brazil has a unique perspective on that because we're located in the Southern Hemisphere, but we also face a lot of the same difficulties and situations as developing countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And we're also quite close to the Americas, which, North America is part of the European Federation currently. And so therefore in Brazil, I'm in meetings with quite a lot of people from the Northern Hemisphere at once and quite a lot with the Southern Hemisphere at once. And what I find is that we do get sidetracked in those meetings by just opposing what the other side thinks for the sake of it and bringing up a concept of how inept each other are. And I think it is almost like it's become a schoolyard situation at the highest levels and it feeds down. And I think it's probably going to become worse over the next couple of months before it gets better. But we do need to step in, almost like it needs a relationship counsellor to sort out some of these things and say, at the end of the day, we're all playing rugby league. And this is quite a useless antagonism that's taking place. It's going to hurt people and hurt the sport at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the counselling sessions between Peter V'landys and Ralph Rimmer. And we should have, should have been the first question, but it ends up being the last. How the hell did you get involved with Brazilian Rugby League?
Yeah, again, convoluted story. My best friend as a child was an Argentinian kid. So, my parents separated in quite a messy way. I didn't have a great life, was growing up in housing commission, that type of thing. And moved to a new school, and this Argentinian kid kind of took me under his wing, and his family did. And I spent a month watching the FIFA World Cup when Argentina won in 1986. And I saw the pageantry and the excitement, and I thought, gee, I want this in my favourite sport, which is rugby league. And it wasn't just Argentina, it was watching Brazil, Mexico, Colombia as well. I've always been fascinated with Latin America. I worked for Queensland Rugby League for about 5 years in the early 2000s. Noticed there were players coming through the system that had heritage in South and Central America, and they had no pathway to international representation. Then when I quit that job, I actually worked on cruise ships, and I was traveling around the world. I went to South America for the first time. And I'd been sponsoring a Colombian child through school to help him. Once he graduated, I decided I wanted to do something that helped South America and kept me connected to that continent in a way that I could enjoy friendships and the culture for a lot longer. So decided to write to Tasbatiri and say, hey, I'd like to get rugby league going in Latin America. And along the way, I got married to a Brazilian. So that's how I've become so aligned to Brazil. But honestly, there's a piece of me that belongs to most of the countries in Latin America. In exhibition games, I've actually played for both Chile and El Salvador when they've fallen short of people and they needed to throw an extra guy on the field. So all of them accuse me at some stage of favouring whoever the other Latin American nation is playing at the time. But the honest truth is that I'm quite partial to all of them.
It's like a referee. As long as you're, partial to all and not impartial, it's okay. I think that's the wrong way. Phil, we're running out of time. Is there anything you want to add?
I just want to say that whatever happens to the World Cup, the bit that's been forgotten in all the discussions of people like Robert, I cannot say too loudly or too highly that the job that he has done to bring rugby league to people through Latin Heat initially, through the development of rugby league in South and Central America is nothing short of heroic. And that's not just saying it because you're on the podcast. I think there are, of all the people we should be consulting about where we go from here, it's people like him, people on the ground who've dedicated their lives to spreading the sport. And that's the bit for me that's been missing. And I hope that whatever the outcome is, we get to see Robert over here leading his Brazilian team, coming out at Headingley for the women's tournament, because I think that, again, is far more important than whether Australia turn up or not.
Robert, thank you very much for your time. We'll keep our fingers crossed. I don't know what the Portuguese is for good luck, but hopefully we'll see you in the autumn.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. I still don't have a clue. Socially distance, of course. But thank you for joining us and taking your time to spread the word about Brazilian Rugby League and the World Cup here on 4020 TV.
Muito obrigado. Beleza.